Hi everyone, and welcome to another video on ROX TV from ROX Network. Regular listeners to ROX Radio will have already heard the name Peter Abzug. He's the host of the show First Wave, a show dedicated to punk and new wave. I'm going to be talking to him about why he is a forever punk. He has his own show on an American non-commercial station known as WPVM 103.7, and he has a lot to say about punk history, punk present, and the future of punk. Take it away, Peter.
Nice to meet you too, Peter. It's nice to put a face to the name.
Yes.
By the way,
yes.
loving the show. I think it's fantastic.
Oh, well, thank you so much. It's always good to get that feedback, any feedback. As you know, you run your own station, and you don't know whether you're going out to crickets or you're actually reaching someone. So every time I get an email, I say, okay, at least one person's listening.
Absolutely, yeah. So to introduce yourself, Peter, how about telling us a bit of your backstory? Who is Peter?
Oh my goodness. So right now I live in Asheville, North Carolina, and I have a show on a local listener-supported station with call letters WPVM. And we're nonprofit, and all of the radio hosts are unpaid. It's mostly a work of love by all of us. We're small, have a fantastic manager of the station who basically said to us when we began is, I'm going to provide you the platform and you do your thing, almost like having a market, and said, you can set up your stand here. You can say, as long as you don't break the law, you're good. And as far as history goes, I was born and raised in New York. I went to university in Boston, Massachusetts, and then went to Washington, D.C., where I worked for about 35 years there. And when COVID hit, I was working for the airlines. So when the COVID hit and everything stopped, the airlines were nice enough to offer myself and a number of other people an offer to leave, and I left. And so we're living down here for about going on 2.5, 3 years, and just love the mountains of North Carolina. Have you ever been here?
I haven't. No, I must confess, I haven't been across the pond.
No.
I know.
No.
Up to one day, you never know.
Okay.
But yes, I would love to. I really would. There's lots of places in the United States I would love to go. Not least of all, I'd love to see the Sunset Strip. That's got
sure. Oh,
really,
sure.
Yeah.
But you'll make it.
Yeah, I'm always optimistic. Was it always punk for you and new wave, or did you sort of roll into punk?
So the way I kind of got into the genre, certainly punk before, is I was at college. I had a roommate who was he was a film major, and actually ended up going to Hollywood and editing. He was an editor and has edited some well-known films. But back then we were all students, and I was kind of complaining to him about the music that we heard on our stations, that it was it was wonderful if you wanted to smoke some pot and go on a mind trip. But I didn't feel it. There was nothing physical, as opposed to when I was listening to bands of the 60s, for example, the Dave Clark Five. I don't know if you know them, but they were a rocking band, and I remember dancing at junior high school dances to them, and it really got me moving. And I said to him, I said, isn't it terrible that there's only like groups like Yes and Emerson, Lake and Palmer and Genesis, like them all. I have Yes albums. I have the early Genesis albums, fabulous albums. But I said to him, I just don't feel it physically. So he was a reader of Andy Warhol's Interview magazine. He's a very hip guy. And he said, well, there's this new group called the Ramones. You might be able to connect with them. So I went out and bought their first album, and the rest is history. I just completely fell in love, not only with them because they were from New York, but their energy, their nonstop energy and power. It was something I had never heard before. And so I started investigating more bands, and I just totally immersed myself. And then the English bands started coming about a year later. Certainly the Sex Pistols, the Clash, the Buzzcocks, great bands, the Damned. These were wonderful bands, and many bands from, I learned a little bit of English geography. I knew where Manchester was and Birmingham was. Of course, I always knew where London was, but these cities seemed to be the ones that where punk was growing. And I just fell in love with these bands because it was, in some ways, they were more interesting than the American bands in not only their lyrics and their energy, but also their dress and so on. And so that just dove me deeper into the genre. And then, as we know, pure punk like that didn't last. Maybe 3 years. It's it's
very short period of time.
Very short period of time, and that morphed into new wave. And there was this kind of gray period, I call it, where Generation X kind of turned into Billy Idol, top 40 hits, that kind of thing. Joy Division, a great band, moving towards that way too. But I still loved it all. And then I got married. I had 2 kids. Kind of it kind of went off the radar. And then when I met the manager of the local radio station here, and she offered me an hour of anything I want to do, I just naturally went back to that. And I was really surprised about listening to it now as opposed to back then. What really surprised me was, and you can see all these news clips on YouTube, all of the the excitement and the trouble these groups got into, and the immense amount of commentary by news people in England, somewhat in the States, that were saying, this is the end of civilization. But when I started in this new, I call it my new wave with punk, is I started listening to the lyrics, and they're brilliant. They're just brilliant. I mean, for example, the Sex Pistols song, of course it goes out of my head, Pretty Vacant.
Yeah.
From their first album. I went, I listened, I read, and Johnny Rotten he is talking as a civil servant there. Of course, I never thought of these things, and the other lyrics he did. Everybody remembers the TV show where they, but they were wonderful songs, and compared to songs today in hip hop and in rap and stuff, these songs today make that look like Montavani String Orchestra. It's so. But I just loved it. I just loved it, and I guess I sort of reawakened now that my kids are grown, and so it's always been in me. Of course, it was a lot easier when I was in my 20s to get into the pogoing and slam dancing.
It's hard on the knees.
It is. It is, but I just love it.
I noticed the guitars. Are you a musician as well?
Yeah, excuse me. I am. Not as, I was in bands since high school, here and there. I mean, I've loved kind of rock music the whole way. And then I got into sort of like the folk scene. So I have a mix of both. I'm not really playing with anyone now. But my last band, I think was probably about 4 years ago. And, yeah, it's in my blood. It's in my blood.
Wow.
Yeah.
You mentioned the sort of really early days of punk and proto-punk. I'm thinking even as far back as the MC5 and the Velvet Underground and Iggy, early on when he was with the Stooges. Does that float your boat as well? I mean, would you call that punk as many people would refer it to as punk, or is it something else?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I have to mention that the MC5 played my high school auditorium.
Wow. When
they were in the beginning. So that was quite revolutionary for my high school. I don't know if the administration would ever have done that again, but they were great. Those bands are so important. And you can call them punk. I call them proto-punk because I think in that timeline, and this is my personal opinion, the Ramones were the beginning of that, really made that sound. But when you listen to the Velvet Underground and you listen to the New York Dolls and Iggy and the Stooges, all of the elements of what punk rock sounded like are there. And in fact, I do on my show every couple of weeks is a proto-punk set. Very important to the English groups were groups like the Kinks, the Who. If you listen to some Jam songs, the Jam in England, I mean, even their look from their early albums was going very reminiscent of the Who in their mod.
Yeah, they were.
Yeah, they were. And Buzzcocks too. They look back to those groups because that was a time where you had, especially to me, the Kinks, you had very staccato type of bar chords going. You all only have to look at You Really Got Me or something like that. And these 70s bands, these punkers said, this is it. This is what we need to channel in our own music. You know, it's interesting. You said, would you consider them punk? And, you know, I get this question is often get an email, what is punk? You know, what is, you know, is the Police punk? Is Talking Heads punk? Is Television punk? Is Joy Division punk? And I always say, you know, at this point, punk is pretty much what you say it is, because my son, who's a drummer in bands in New York, he'll send me some music that he calls punk, and that is his punk. Yeah. To me, it's a lot of screaming of words that, you know, sound like the singer's being eaten by a monster. You know, but that's a generational thing. Yeah, yeah. A lot of people, you know, the group Television, they were the first group to play CBGBs in New York. They were indeed, yeah. They were, and 4 months later, the Ramones opened for them. And if you listen to Television, people were calling that punk, but it's very mellow music. So I think it's, as far as the music goes, you know, it's really an individual thing. Certainly, there are bands like one of my favorite band is Sham 69 from England. Yeah, yeah. To me, that's the epitome of punk. But that's me. I think punk too is the attitude, and the fashion. And these things, regardless of what you or me or somebody over here might define as punk music, because I mean, you could say Green Day is punk music, and I can understand that. Yeah. The fashion and the attitude lives on. So I recently interviewed a couple of editors from newspaper, now it's online, called Boston Groupie News, and we were discussing, you know, the early days of punk. One of the editors was a punkette, I don't know what you call it, but she says, you know, I look around now, and when we were trying to get dressed for the clubs, we would rip holes in our jeans. We would wear the type of pants, I forgot what exactly they're called, but they just kind of went down to the ankle. And we searched everywhere in the stores for like dark shaded makeup for eyes and lips, and there was none. We had to make our own. But now I look around and I see women in jeans with these holes in it that they paid $200 for. Yeah. So all of these things, I think, the influence, the attitude, the ambience of the genre lives on. And to me, the bottom line is, I think punk rock really saved the world from alternative music, you know, the 20-minute drum solos, you know, and it was getting way too much. Yeah. But the other thing too, Carrie-Anne, is what was great about punk for musicians here and in the UK. When you look at a group like Yes and Rick Wakeman, he's a classically trained musician. Yeah. You listen to those albums, they're very sophisticated. You know, very detailed. It's almost like a Bach sonata, and they're wonderful in that sense. But when the Ramones played the Roundhouse in London, and you had future Clash, Sex Pistols, and Buzzcocks members there in the audience, just wanted to see them. The Ramones told them, you don't have to have gone and got a proper musical education. You just need 3 chords, attitude, and make it so you're giving out energy. And a lot of these musicians, a lot of these early punkers said, I saw this band and I was fooling around with the guitar and I would love to have been in a band, but they were the ones that said, you know what, I can make it too. And so it just launched thousands of bands, just like the Beatles did.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, it brought music back to the people again. Just like, I mean, you mentioned classical music, and at one time it was very, very pompous, and you had to have a full orchestra, and then and before you knew it, you had chamber music which people could perform in their own home with very simple melodies and repetition. It's the same sort of thing again, isn't it? Like prog was all, you had to have a rack of keyboards that looked like Starship Enterprise, and and it was distilled down to what is music. And that's something that is timeless, I think.
I agree with you. In fact, Asheville, we're right in the middle of the Appalachian Mountains here. And Appalachia is known for their bluegrass music and those kind of things. And I was talking with somebody recently who's really into that genre, and I was explaining what punk was and the whole do-it-yourself thing, how these people were able to cut records and sell them at their concerts. And he said, you know what, that sounds like folk music. It's the music of the people.
Yeah.
That you don't need that to be able to connect with other people, because you have the energy and you have the attitude to do that. And I thought, just like you said, I never thought of it that way, but it's true. You're right. It's a homegrown. It's from the people.
And it's you mentioned lyrics as well. It's all about things that happen to people's lives, things that make them angry, things that make people happy, things that really wind them up. It's real life situations rather than a story of a wizard that's going into a mountain, and you've got to imagine this big mountain with this dragon and all of it. This is really people, like as you say, folk roots. It's relaying situations, and I mean, Sex Pistols were atypical of that, really, because they were singing about what life was like in Britain at the time, which was really bad, and the Ramones and people like that in the United States were again talking about the level of oppression that was going on. It speaks to people on a very low level.
I learned a lot about Britain from the Sex Pistols when I was younger, because they'd sing these songs and, the refrain of no future made me want to go to the newspapers and news and say, well, how are they coming up with these lyrics? What's going on in Britain where, a teenager doesn't see a future for themselves?
Yeah.
In fact, I asked Steve Diggle of the Buzzcocks when I interviewed him, I said, can you tell me, when you were a teenager and getting up there, tell me what was going on in Manchester. And he just said nothing. He said nothing. So it was, certainly a reaction to that. In New York, it's interesting. It wasn't so much no future, although at the time there was a terrible inflation here because Vietnam had just ended. Yeah. And many people don't realize that the government here never taxed for the war. They just printed more money. And
Which
so
got to be paid back.
There you go. And when the war ended, we had all this money and just wasn't worth much. And then inflation went up. And New York City, I was there in the 70s. It was going broke. It was, I mean, places now are that are very posh or hip. My parents would never let me go to them. I mean, you were asking for trouble. Walking in Central Park, you were asking for trouble. There were strikes. There were garbage strikes. In fact, the New York Dolls have a number called Trash, which is all about the New York garbage strikes. And CBGB's was in a part of Manhattan called the Bowery, which is where all the homeless and alcoholics used to hang out.
Very, very run down, isn't it?
Yeah, very run down. And so a lot of their music and other bands, a lot about drugs, especially Dee Ramone wrote a lot about his heroin addiction, even gave those songs to other groups. This was New York at the time, and nobody thought, I mean, there was this great flight to the suburbs. You know, people moved to Connecticut and New Jersey because they couldn't take it. But so you see that reflected in a lot of that music too. So it's very interesting. Yeah, I mean, it really was, I felt, a time where there was a deep connection between New York and London and Birmingham and Manchester. To a lesser extent, Los Angeles, they're kind of in their own bubble there. It's a whole different scene. But it was really, we were feeding off each other.
Yeah.
And
sending stuff across the pond.
Yeah. It was so exciting. It was so exciting. And, you know, I saw the Ramones in person with the Runaways, which is Joan Jett's original group, opening up for them. And then when I lived in Germany for a time, I saw the Clash and Elvis Costello in a like a gymnasium. I mean, this was at the very beginning of their careers. And, you know, I'd come out of those concerts black and blue and feel exhausted, but in such a good way, such a great way that, I don't know, it was just very exciting. So there was this definite thing going on between the US and Britain, which was just fabulous. Absolutely. Yeah.
You mentioned CBGBs. How important do you think that was? Because I mean, it was a very grassroots venue, and he gave young bands like the Ramones and like Television a break, and Blondie, of course, gave them a chance, and also it gave people an opportunity to just kick back. Just wasn't a fancy place where you felt you really got to behave. You could just have fun.
Well, they say if you haven't, well, of course, CBGB's is gone.
Yeah, but sadly, which is a terrible loss.
They used to say, if you haven't been to the bathroom at CBGB's, then you're not a real punk rocker, because it was disgusting. But the owner of it, his name was Hilly Crystal.
Yeah.
And he was a Dutch immigrant, and I believe he's Dutch, and he had owned a bar on the west side of Manhattan and found this bar below a hotel that basically catered to prostitutes and kind of fleabag people. And he said when he bought the bar, he had to have it fumigated because there were all sorts of things growing on the wall. So he fixed it up, and it's kind of interesting how that started. Is it okay to talk about that?
You carry on, yeah, absolutely.
A brief. So he's out there putting the famous awning that's at CBGB's on it. And Tom Verlaine, who has just died within the past 6 months, the leader of television, walked by and started a conversation with him and said, well, you know, what are you doing here? He said, well, I'm thinking of maybe putting some bands on, I don't know. And that was it. He walked away, and a couple of days later, their manager, and we're not talking about a high-powered manager here, we're talking probably a friend, went to him and said, look, you got to get these guys on stage. They'll love it. Your audience will love them. You make a lot of money at the bar. He said, okay, I'll try them. So they go on stage, and Hilly later said they were awful. They didn't even know how to play their instruments. It was like, what am I doing here? So he starts complaining to the manager. He said, listen, they're going to go back and they're going to practice and they're going to get really good. But in the meantime, I have this other band from Queens named the Ramones. Why don't you give them a try? I think you'll have a better success. And then Hilly later says they were worse than television. They fought on stage with each other. Okay, they'd actually have fights. It would take them, you know, they'd argue over which song to play next. And then they would play, even with that, they'd eventually play their whole set of songs in 20 minutes. When normally you're up there for an hour, you know, you just go through it. And so they'd start again. And so Crystal tells this guy, you know, nothing, no more. So a few months later, the guy, the manager says to Crystal, listen, I guarantee you don't have to pay him anything. Just let's get him on stage. So he got television and the Ramones at the same time on stage. They were better. And then all of a sudden, you started seeing like the bands you referred to. Let's say take Blondie for an example. Yeah. She and her future husband, Chris Stein, who eventually formed Blondie, they were in another band. He was playing backup to an old girl trio called the Stilettos. And Debbie was one of the Stilettos, and then they broke up. And she and Chris formed Blondie. And then they started getting up there, and then the word started getting out. There's one thing in New York, you know, it's a big city, but once word gets out, it's like the biggest telegraph line all around. And people started coming down. And you're exactly right. He did open up the gates for them. And he also insisted, one of his things was, if you're a band and you're going to play my club, you play original songs. This is not for cover. You know, you play original songs, and that's all I want to hear here. And soon the record executives heard this, and Seymour Stein, who just died, who was founder of Sire Records, who died last week, who signed Madonna and originally signed Madonna, Talking Heads. He went down there. His daughter brought him down there. He saw him. He said, I got to have these guys. And then you start the process. That and one other place in New York were really the only place where you could hear punk rock. The media ignored the genre totally. That's where you get Punk Magazine, Legs McGill, who started writing about the scene. Television and radio, it was just like England. Look at these filthy people. Look at this. You know, in front of a lot of my shows, I play these news commentaries from way back then saying, you know, punk rock's going to be the death of civilization. It's the root of all evil. So they were on that bandwagon until finally some people started listening and saying, you know what, it's pretty good stuff. And then it started advancing out. And as I say, for England, I the most monumental historical thing that happened was the Roadhouse in London with the Ramones. I think you can even see that on YouTube. I believe it's up there. And that launched 1,000 British bands. So CBGB's was sort of ground zero in the States. I believe there is a place in England called the 100 Club, but I'm not sure.
It is, yeah. And they were very, very influential on the UK.
What city were they in?
In London, 100
Club. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So this was our 100 Club. And so what eventually happened, the years went by, he started having new wave bands and so on. And then the lower part of Manhattan there all of a sudden started gentrifying. And in fact, right now, in place of CBGB's is a John Vivartos boutique. So that's the way the neighborhood is going. His rent went, I think, from $10,000 a month to like 40. And he just said, I can't make a living this way. So he closed it down. Yeah, but it is a definitely very influential, like your 100 Club, and very important in the whole genre.
You mentioned the Sex Pistols. I also want to talk about that one. I want to talk about Malcolm McLaren because he was over in the States listening to all this going on with you guys, with like the Ramones, the Dolls, and he was listening very intently to this. And Aaron is no fool when it comes to what's going to be the next big thing. And the Sex Pistols sort of came about, didn't they, as a almost McLaren's input into the UK music scene. Of saying this, you've got to listen to this, you've got to do that. But talking about what you were talking about earlier on, which was the fashion, because he was very much into the fashion, wasn't he, as well, especially with Vivian Westwood, who's passed away as well, sadly.
Right.
A pair of them had a shop called Sex, didn't they? And to some extent, the Sex Pistols became mannequins, if you like, for the way to look if you want to be a punk. What's your feelings on that? Do you think, because a lot of people in Britain, they think the Sex Pistols kind of sold out?
Well, look, that's what they said about Green Day when they left Oakland, California. They sold out. I've sort of grappled with this in myself. And first of all, they would, with the fashion, what Vivian was doing, and Reebok, which was the same kind of store in New York, they were creating fashion. They were artists. Vivian's an artist.
Yes.
Revolutionary artist. And I don't see the Sex Pistols as selling out to that. It was part of their whole, they were revolutionary. It seems to me so understandable that they would be attracted to that kind of fashion, because that's where they were at. And I've never heard, you're the first person who used the word sellout with the Sex Pistols. I've never heard that. But, you know what? You've heard that over there. Here's the thing. I'm not saying every band is like this. And this is, I think, kind of tragic about the Ramones, too. is even though bands say, "Oh, we're power to the people, and we're not sellouts, and we're gonna throw bottles across the room and yada yada yada," they want to be successful,
of course,
right? They have the drive. They want to be successful. And, if you listen to early Blondie records, songs, they channel the 60s for sure. Compare that to later on, where their whole mystique around Debbie Harry.
Yeah.
One could call that selling out, but who are they selling out? Their times change. And I think the Sex Pistols, that was their thing. Sid Vicious, I mean, he took it to the extreme. But I think the fashion, and as I said before, it's lasted. It's still there today.
Very much so, yeah.
Yeah. So I don't see that. What I personally look at are the songs. Okay, that to me is what they do. I think it's fine. The Sex Pistols, want to dress. They made an artistic statement musically and in their fashion and in their attitude.
Yeah.
They're artists. That's what it comes down to. So this is all part. And Malcolm probably said, "Look, guys, you want to be successful? You want to have a record deal? This is what you got to do." Just like Brian Epstein did with the Beatles.
He did.
Right?
Yeah.
He saw these four guys come on stage, not dressed very well, yelling at the audience and all this. And he said, "Look, you guys are great. But if you want to be successful, you better put on, back then, suit and tie, do not chew gum. And John, keep your mouth shut." And, and all this. And they became successful. So I don't think they sold anybody out. I think they did what they had to do in one instance, but they did it with Vivian in an artistic way that, to me, mapped very much with their music. I mean, who else would, you know this better than me. Were people walking around with pictures of Queen Elizabeth with a safety pin through her nose?
Yeah.
I mean, so.
Still get those T-shirts today in the UK. Still
Isn't that something? Isn't that something?
And you mentioned new wave as well. Punk sort of evolved into new wave. Do you think it kept the same? Because particularly in Britain, it became very fashion orientated. The new wave movement, especially in the club scene, where you had the likes of Spandau Ballet and people like that were very, very. So it was all about the look. But do you still think that kind of punk mentality, that kind of working class energy, was retained throughout the new wave movement?
It's hard to say. I think of a group like Depeche Mode. Great haircuts. Oh, great haircuts. I think what happened really, I think it was just a natural and evolution. I mean, when you look at Kraftwerk from Germany, bringing to forefront the synthesizers that they use, which a lot of these bands took a cue from and started putting those in their act. And I think what happened, my personal opinion, is once the large record companies, EMI, Decca, over here, Columbia, and so on, started getting involved, that's where you either had bands that's like the Sex Pistols, who trashed, I think it was EMI's office or something. And, they had one album and they got booted from 2 record companies. Or you had groups that didn't want to do that, wanted to be successful. And the record companies, the producers are saying, well, if you want to be successful, you got to do it my way. So it kind of cut the edge from a lot. I think the Clash are a good example. Nothing bad about the Clash.
No,
love them. But listen to their first album, how hard cutting it is, how it's like Joe Strummer is throwing nails at you. And then look at an album like London Calling, which is much more produced.
Yeah.
A lot of overdubs and things like that. Probably their most successful album. Not one of my favorites, but probably the most successful album. So I think it's a natural evolution. I don't know, the attitude and, Depeche Mode probably wasn't trashing clubs, or Joy Division. They were putting out great music. But I don't know, when I look back at it, it's almost like a shooting star. It starts, it gets real bright, and then it just kind of peters out. And you either see that shooting star or you don't. You miss it. Yeah. And
it's a good way of looking at it.
Yeah. And in a way, maybe that's best. A lot of my contemporaries here haven't a clue about punk rock. I mean, people who are my age who could have been listening at the time. My station manager says, I always listen to your show because I don't know a thing about this. I can tell you all about folk music and classical music. And I said, well, it was such a short period of time.
It was, but it left a hell of a legacy. Talking of legacy, with all these young bands now coming on the scene, and they've all just completely ignored the record labels, and they're all doing it themselves. They put it out on Spotify and CD Baby. And do you feel like me that it's almost like going back again, and you've got all these young angry kids, and they're doing new modern punk, they're doing skate punk, they're doing thrash, they're doing crossover, hardcore. It's that same what's the word I'm looking for? Same energy.
And irreverence to the major labels. The first Buzzcock record was their own record. They pressed it. Has some early songs in it. Some of them sound almost exactly like the Sex Pistols, but that's another discussion. But they were, I think, one of the very early DIYers who went in, recorded, pressed their records.
They did,
jams and sell it. I think you're 110% correct. It has seemed to go that way because technology now has made it easy. These bands today can release tons of music, and they don't need a machine that presses CD. A lot of them now are pressing vinyl. In fact, Asheville has a big vinyl plant now that never stops. There's just so much vinyl now. But I think you're absolutely correct. It is swung back to the way you can get your music out there, either over the internet, mostly over the internet. I very rarely now see bands that have CDs where you can buy their CDs. It's, go to Apple Music, go to this. And, I think it's wonderful. It's wonderful because record companies have always been, except for those bright stars like Seymour Stein or a Columbia Records, Nat Hentoff, or those places who who knew when they heard Billie Holiday sing, this was magic, who at EMI knew when the Beatles came into the studio, even though they weren't, very suave or suave, they had it. Now they can put this out and other people can see that. And record companies, I remember a great interview. I think it was with Mick Jagger. He said, you know what? Today, if we were the Rolling Stones, we'd probably never be signed. Because back then, a record company would take a chance on an artist.
And develop
them. Right. And if their first album doesn't do that well, that's okay. We've signed them for 3. Let's see what we can do. That doesn't happen today.
No, it doesn't.
No. And I think it's a shame because there is so much talent out there.
There is, yeah.
Yeah. On the other hand, Carrie, there's so much competition for attention. So if I was in a rock band and I say, well, sure, I don't need the big record companies. I'll just do it myself and do that. Well, you go on band, I got the name of the website, Bandcamp, Spotify. You can get your music on there, but you're competing with terabytes of other bands' music. So
it's hard. It's very hard for them.
It is. And I guess one thing you could say, although it was imperfect, about the record companies, since they had the only technology for you to reach, is they were kind of a filter. But I play a lot of, in my proto-punk segment, of regionally based music that came out in the 60s, because that was a time, and I don't know about Britain, but America's so big that back in the 50s and 60s, each medium to large city had their own labels, and you could go to it, and a band could have a hit in, let's say, Minneapolis, but never anywhere else, or Houston or Los Angeles, and gain a reputation there. It wasn't until I think radio came, the big corporations with radio, because the local stations would play it, say, here's a group from, Greenville, right down the line, and so on. Then you had programming done at a corporate headquarters. You still do. They decide what the whole nation should hear. So it's a mixed bag, and I try not to labor too much because I don't want to be an old crotchety guy who says, you kids don't know what it is.
No, I know. I'm going to put you on the spot here now, Peter. I'd love to hear what your favourite 3 punk new wave songs are.
Songs? Wow. From classic.
Any era.
Okay. Oh God, there are so too many of them. One I mentioned before is Pretty Vacant by the Sex Pistols. Well, as far as the Ramones go, I mean, again, they have so many, but I'll just say Blitzkrieg Bop.
Oh, good choice.
Which was the first cut on their first album. And I think a song that really has all the elements of punk rock as far as music goes, lyrics, and just the whole attitude, written by Joan Jett for the Runaways, School Days. Now, everybody knows the Runaways for Cherry Bomb and Queens of Noise.
Yeah.
School Days is all about, she's writing about turning 18 and she's finally going to be free from her parents. And she says, I never made the honor roll in school. I never read a book. I was just waiting. I'm turning 18 and goodbye. It has the attitude of punk. It has the chords, the power chords of punk. Because she was very much part of that New York scene. She was very much influenced by that.
She is.
So to me, that particular song is one of my favorites.
Fantastic choices.
Too many.
It's been lots of really great punk songs.
Yes. So tell me. Go ahead.
No, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. You carry on.
I want to know about you.
Hey.
I know this is an interview for me. I mean, unless you don't want.
No.
Tell me about your.
Thank you for watching this documentary from ROX Network. If you've enjoyed this show, please consider subscribing, liking and leaving comments. This helps the algorithms on YouTube and helps our audience grow so we can provide yet more interesting documentaries for everyone to enjoy. Check out our website at www.roxnetwork.co.uk. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. And don't forget to check out ROX Radio. There is something for everybody on ROX Radio, from classic rock to modern independent metal.